December 5th, 1946, White Sands, New Mexico. Almost exactly 16 months after the A-bomb is dropped on Hiroshima, the U.S. Army is about to make its first major test of a ballistic rocket. An altitude of 117 miles will be achieved, a world's record. This rocket is not American, however. It is German. This rocket is Hitler's secret weapon. We are familiar with U.S. and Russian missiles for carrying nuclear warheads and men to the moon. But this could not have taken place were it not for what happened in Germany between 1924 and 1945. Their space rockets were developed from futuristic fantasy into military reality. This one, the V-2, was used to attack both London and Antwerp. In 1945, the rocket, the secret documents, and the film we will show were brought to this country. With them came those who had worked on the rockets and who were now to work in the U.S. arms and space business. The military commander of the V-2 project and former vice president of Bell Aircraft, General Dornberger.
After the First World War, there were a lot of articles in German newspapers all over the world about modern rockets which could go to the moon and into space. And these articles were written by mostly not engineers, but by looking for sensation writers.
But not only writers. This epic film, Die Frau im Mond, The Lady in the Moon, created a lot of attention in a Germany trying to ignore the consequences of World War I. One of those intrigued by the film was a senior V-2 engineer now at Rockwell International, Dr. Kraft Erika.
It impressed me enormously. I was at that time 12 years old, and it shocked me into the awareness that all of a sudden you might be able to leave this planet to open a whole new world. And since my interest already at that time was in history, in astronomy, in the evolution of man, so to say, in a very simple way, it kind of gave me a tremendous impulse to interest myself in space. And after about 2 or 3 years in reading books about it and so forth, I became firmly determined that this is an area of technology I wanted to devote my life to.
With its life support systems and multi-stage rockets, Die Frau im Mond foreshadowed many of the ideas that were incorporated in the Apollo moonshots. The fact that Die Frau im Mond attracted engineers was one reason that German rocket development went ahead of the rest of the world. But the film was not just idle fantasy. Fritz Lang, the director, had appointed one of the great minds in rocketry as his advisor, Hermann Oberth. Oberth was an obscure Romanian schoolteacher. It was his book, with its extensive theoretical detail, that was also the starting point for an aristocratic schoolboy fascinated by space travel, Werner von Braun.
I was appalled by the fact that it was filled with mathematical equations, and at that time neither math nor physics were exactly my strengths at school, so I went to my math teacher and asked him what I could do to understand this book, because I really wanted to understand whether it was possible to build such rockets.
What then is a rocket? This is the basic diagram taken from Oberth's book. To operate outside the atmosphere, a space rocket must be self-contained and consist of a compartment for the guidance system that can pass instructions to the steering mechanism, a compartment for the fuel, another for the oxidizer, which is essential because in space there is no outside air, a combustion chamber capable of controlling the explosion that gives the rocket its thrust, and a configuration that will enable it to fly with stability. That is a theory. To put it into effect will require the development of whole new technologies. In a sense, these solid fuel rockets were no more than metal tubes filled with gunpowder, requiring kid glove treatment. Lighter liquid fuels giving far greater range were not yet available. The groups were amateur, thus the problem was to raise money. And so rocketry achieved in Germany something of the status of barnstorming in America. Other people had other ideas. Gerhard Zucker thought that he would use a rocket to send mail to America. Then there were attempts to interest industry, for German industry in the 20s was already looking for a role in space travel. From the beginning, however, manned flight was in mind, and all the appropriate scientific tests being made. Cats were not the only casualties. Handling rockets was akin to handling fire. Among the early victims was Max Valier. A close friend of his, a senior V-2 engineer and later manager of the Saturn V project, was Arthur Rudolph.
The test started off fine, but then after about 20 or 30 seconds, I found myself lying on my back. And when I finally got up, I saw that the rocket was gone, had disappeared. And only a big cloud of steam shot out of the pipes. And then I saw Max Valier waving back and forth. And so Riedel ran to him and grabbed him under his arms to steady him. But then he let go of Valier and started running towards the guardhouse. And I knew something was terribly wrong. And when I got down to Valier, because I was on a slight slope, he had already fallen down on his face. And when I turned him around, I saw that he was very badly hit by a shrapnel piece from the exploding engine. And he was bleeding profusely and was dying right there.
This is the kind of rocket motor that killed Valier. It consists of a combustion chamber surrounded by a water jacket with two pipes feeding oxygen and gasoline under pressure. It looks primitive, but the advance to liquid fuels is a great step forward. This group is the Berlin-based Society for Space Travel, to which von Braun belongs. Their decision to go into liquid fuels and engine development, rather than experiment with flight, is essential if a rocket is ever to reach space. The purpose of these tests is to find out something about the behavior of fuels under condition where their flow can be controlled by this primitive system of pulleys and rigs. Explosions of the kind that killed Valier were not uncommon. The liquid coming out of the top is water for cooling. As a rocket is no more than a controlled explosion, the only way so far to prevent the apparatus melting is to attach to it the water main. Thus, it is a major event when Johannes Winkler makes a liquid fuel rocket with everything self-contained. He has surrounded the motor with the fuel tanks, using the fuel itself for cooling. The date is October 6, 1932. This test is to prove a milestone in the development of rocketry in Germany. One reason this test is important is that it's an early major test of the liquid fuel rocket in flight. But there is another. The presence of the military, severely curtailed in Germany as a result of World War I.
The Treaty of Versailles, it forbids the German army to develop certain guns and weapons which were superior. And we were restricted, the German army was restricted to very primitive weapons. When the army recovered a little bit, they thought about weapons which could replace this old junk, and found out in these articles a way to develop this kind of weapons.
Rocketry had its origins in World War I, which stands on the threshold between 19th and 20th century warfare. Tanks are used in the same assault as horses. The question that concerns those who remain in the defeated German army is how it can modernize itself. One possibility would have been the development of more weapons like this, the Paris gun. But the Paris gun was banned under the Versailles Treaty. However, there is in the treaty no mention of rockets. Why not a rocket as a kind of gigantic flying shell? With this in mind, the Army, in the person of General Dornberger, makes overtures to a 19-year-old German engineering student.
Now I was looking for people who could help us. We had one mechanic, and that was all. And I met Werner von Braun during my visits at the Raketenflugplatz Berlin, and met him later on a car drive from a meeting in Berlin to my home, where he interrupted our talk with a typical scientific remark. When I asked him how he knew about it, he said, I worked in that field. I said, okay, why don't you come to my office? Maybe I have a position for you.
Now, he said we have to conduct this work behind the fence of an army post because we are interested in keeping this work secret, classified. And so he offered me one half of one old test stand in Kummersdorf to conduct this work.
It was at Kummersdorf, outside Berlin, that the first two Army-backed rockets, the A-1 and the A-2, were developed. It was there that the rocket engine was tested, but the actual flight had to take place here, on the island of Oy in the Baltic. The rocket in this crate is the Army's third model, the A-3, with a thrust 50 times as great as any rocket we have yet seen. While there has been rocket development in other countries, under Goddard in the US, for example, military backing has now put German rocket development way ahead of the rest of the world, so the talk of getting into space is no longer a fantasy. The main problem of the rockets, however, is no longer power, but stability. In this rocket, von Braun has inserted a gyroscopic stabilization system connected to the exterior tail fins. If this works, it will prevent the rocket flying randomly and will be the successful culmination of 5 years' work by von Braun and his team. The rocket flies well, but the stabilization system fails to stop it turning into the wind. The next day, a second A-3 is fired. Once again, the firing goes perfectly. But once again, the rocket's course is erratic. To make improvements will require a new concept of design, something which is only possible thanks to the marriage between von Braun and the Army with its huge resources.
The chef of the German Ordnance Department came to see us at Kummersdorf. And during that visit of General Becker, he was, by the way, a doctor of engineering and also a professor, he questioned us about our progress. And during the discussion he had with von Braun did not talk about the weapons we were supposed to build, but about space flight. And however, General Becker was very nice about it, but he argued with von Braun and told him, von Braun, you will never make it. You will not be able to harness the energies necessary to get you into space.
By the time the A-3 is tested, not only do the pioneers of German rocketry have the support of the German Army, the Versailles Treaty has been torn up by Hitler. In 1935, Germany has rearmed. What will Hitler's attitude to the rocket be? For the moment, the rocket is not commanding enough resources to catch his personal attention. Although once World War II begins, the fortunes of the rocket and Hitler's own fortunes will become dramatically entwined. As yet, Hitler's attention is more with the conventional forces and with the Air Force. In the rearmament, the emphasis is on the new Air Force under Hermann Goering. Thus far, the rocket has been supported by the Army. The rocket has been seen essentially as a huge artillery show. But now there is strong rivalry between the Army and the Air Force. Might not the Air Force, the new prestige service, have a use for rockets as well?
Of course, as a newborn service, they were rich and young and energetic and had absolutely no concern even of picking up technology from a sister service. So they asked us whether we could develop a rocket power plant that we could put on an experimental basis into an existing propeller-driven fighter aircraft. We accepted this job because they paid, and it was like working for a contractor.
This is the Heinkel 112, the first rocket-assisted airplane to be designed by von Braun and his team. Within a few months, it is ready for test trials.
They said, gee, this is great, let's have more of this. Now, very soon it turned out that the Air Force wanted additional things, like J2 units to help push big bombers with extra payload off runways. And to do all this, we would have to build new facilities, hire new personnel, and so forth. We said, then we have to move somewhere else. Now, the Air Force thought in terms of millions, where we thought in terms of thousands of marks. And so this Major von Richthofen, a nephew, by the way, of the famous Red Baron of World War I fame, who was in charge of aircraft development in the Air Ministry, said, oh, nothing to it. I give you 5 million marks, you know, and you build a facility somewhere else.
Pre-war Nazi Germany. Even now, there is the beginning of a struggle for control of the rocket. It is taking place without Hitler's knowledge. It shows that all power in Germany does not rest with him. It's a struggle which von Braun is able to exploit. He describes the Army's reaction to the Air Force's offer.
They had the feeling here was that junior service trying to steal a great new invention from the Army. And Becker made a comment that he would see to it that the Luftwaffe remained the junior service in this rocket field, which meant to all intents and purposes that he backed the Air Force's input of or investment of 5 million marks with 6, and suddenly I had 11. And so in this way, we hit the big time.
Von Braun took me with him to the German Air Ministry one day. And there we talked to a Mr. Böhmker. And within a few minutes, von Braun had convinced him that the Air Force and the Army together should establish a new place, a rocket development base.
First thing was, of course, where should we go? It was pretty obvious that we should go to a site close to the water, because even then we were thinking of long-range rockets of the future. So it was logical to find a place from which, in relative safety and security, you could launch along a coastline where optical tracking equipment would be located. And my mother told me, why don't you also take a look at Peenemünde? My father used to shoot ducks there. You know, this is a wide area, uninhabited, but very pretty. And it was really love at first sight.
As a symbol of the Air Force's involvement, Peenemünde was not built to Army standards of construction, but to those of the Air Force, which were more comfortable. Gradually, the pleasant pine woods by the sea were being transformed into one of the largest establishments for military research in the world. This was to be the beginning of the 1,000-year Reich. By mid-1938, Peenemünde was essentially a complete town in itself. Situated due north of Berlin, it satisfied the requirements of proximity to the sea, as well as those of secrecy. Being placed on the tip of an island, foreign agents hardly knew of its existence. It was equipped with everything: a plant for generating power, laboratories, facilities for liquid oxygen production, test stands, even its own railroad. Only a few years before, von Braun had started under General Dornberger with a single mechanic. But here it is planned to employ 30,000 people. The rocket now under development is the A-5, an experimental rocket whose main purpose is still to get over the problem of stability that the A-3 has not solved. Whereas in the A-3, the guidance system was removed from the nose to the center, these engineers are working on a radical design to solve the problem of the rocket's erratic flight. The rudders will actually be in the exhaust. If these rockets succeed on their test flights, it will become the basis for the A-4, or V-2, as it will be known when used against Britain and Belgium. Although the main factories at Peenemünde are in production during 1938, the test stands are not yet ready. As a result, each rocket has to be taken by road and sea to the island of Oy for testing. For all the apparent peacefulness of the North German setting and the joviality surrounding trials, each test is under close scrutiny. A race is now being run against time. Research budgets are run through quickly with the huge establishment at Peenemünde. Things go wrong. There's a delay in a wind tunnel, so that more full-scale tests like this have to be made, and the rocket's behavior judged by observation from this tower. But as so many have done, the rocket turns into the wind and begins to spin. This is disappointment again. But there is one new development, the introduction of radio-controlled parachutes, so that for the first time, rockets can be recovered. Is this a potentially effective weapon? To take things farther will demand a quantum leap in the research budget, and all that involves politically in a Germany on the brink of war. In these circumstances, enthusiasm and influence are as important as money.
In 1939, we were so far with the rocket development that we really could show something. And we were establishing at that time already the experimental station in Peenemünde, and we wanted more support. We knew that the project, when it really started running, would cost a lot of money, a lot of millions, hundreds of millions, even billions. And we needed the support of the only man in Germany who could give that money. That was Hitler.
In March 1939, Hitler comes to a rocket motor test.
You know, normally people were pretty much impressed by the noise, but he didn't say a word. And then we showed him a model of the A3, you know, with gyroscopes and all these things, and he listened quietly to my explanation, and at the end he turned away shaking his head. So I had the distinct impression that he felt that thing will never work, or a crazy idea or something like this.
Well, Hitler's attitude toward technology must be understood, I think, out of his historical view. And his historical view was strictly shaped by the battles and the events, I think, of the 17th, 18th, and the early 19th century.
In September 1939, Hitler attacked Poland. The victory was an easy one, and Warsaw totally destroyed. This was his great period of confidence. The idea of a wonder weapon with years of development ahead must have seemed remote. Was Hitler old-fashioned in his view of war? Or was it rather that his new ideas for high-speed blitzkrieg and bombing were achieving his aims? Yet, while he's caught up in the details of war, work on the rocket continues. Thanks to connections that General Dornberger and others have, during the first 2 years of the war, 1,200 engineers were sneaked out of the army under Hitler's eye, many of them saved from death on the Russian front. Their purpose was to develop the V2, whose engine is being tested here. While the thrust of the A3 was measured in pounds, this is measured in tons. Well, this rocket is the first in history to go into space and to reach supersonic speeds. Only by breaking out of the atmosphere can the rocket achieve the range to attack England.
So it came that we are looking around in Germany for a man capable to develop a supersonic wind tunnel. And this man was Dr. Rudolf Hermann in Aachen. It's the University Aachen. He joined us and built the first supersonic wind tunnel with Mach number 4.5 in Peenemünde.
This is test film of Dr. Hermann's wind tunnel, not only the first at Peenemünde, but the first in the world. Using this film, the configuration of the V2 was worked out. But a rocket is a system, and each part of the rocket system has to dovetail with the next. The biggest problem is still guidance, how to get the rocket to go first vertically on a takeoff, and then change course for its target. This is the gyroscopic stabilization platform for the V2. Any deflection in the rocket's path is detected here, and the information transmitted to the newly developed graphite jet vanes in the exhaust, which will bring it back on course. Arthur Rudolph.
Well, in these 3 short years, we brought the A4 from a project on paper to a flight system, which for the first time brought a projectile or a system into space. And in doing so, actually, every step we took was a step into the unknown.
You see, we had only very few days of cloudless weather where the rocket launches took place. And so very often, even later on when the A4, the V2 was under development, the rocket would disappear in the clouds in perfect flight. And suddenly there was a big bang above the clouds, and a few minutes later some debris was raining out of the clouds.
Only so much can be learned in the laboratory. Only so much can be learned from firing tests. 2 V2 tests have already failed. One has exploded 30 feet into the air, the other after flying a mile or so. The rocket is designed to carry a warhead of 1 ton for 200 miles. But will it become operational before the war is ended? And what is the point of developing a weapon at such huge cost when the job can be done by bombers? As the war wears on into the beginning of its 4th year, these are the questions that need to be answered, and answered soon. The date is October 3rd, 1942. General Dornberger.
And it was a very critical point. The high officials were pressing us for results. And we had 2 failures where the missile didn't go up or failed during flight. All depended on this day. And this day was the first one, which really brought us the distance we were looking for, brought us the accuracy we were looking for, and the perfection of our equipment.
On the side of the rocket is the insignia of the Lady in the Moon from Fritz Lang's film. It is 11 years since the German army first became involved in rockets. Those 11 years have witnessed what must be considered one of the major engineering achievements of the 20th century. This is to be the day of triumph.
Well, we had a little party that evening, a little celebration. And I remember that Dornberger made a pretty emotional speech at that on that day, which typically didn't talk about weapons at all, but he said, "Do you realize that today the spaceship was born?" So the attitude that most of us engineers had, that we were working on something far beyond the scope of weaponry, had actually infected the military as well.
Whenever we wanted to make improvements and refinements, or were thinking of increasing the performance of the V2 for research purposes or applying it for high-altitude research, he always made it clear, look, first things first. We are in a war. We have a clear assignment, and that is to develop a means equivalent to long-range artillery.
And our aim from the very beginning was not only this weapon, we had to do it, because nobody in the whole world at that time would have given us the money just to go in space to the moon to find out that there's nothing on the moon. We had to develop a weapon first to prove that reliable gimmick like the V2 could be developed as a predecessor of later space flight.
The successful test means that the rocket can go into production under Albert Speer. Meetings are set up between industrialists, the military, and the engineers. Speer sets goals for production. But many of the industrialists are skeptical, having recently been told by Hitler to use all their production capacity for tanks and planes on the Russian front. However, Speer is insistent. General Dornberger.
When we had to go in production, we were running difficulty because Hitler had cut us from the priority list, and we had to use all excuses and everything to get at least something to stay living. But Speer appointed Mr. Degenkolb, who was in charge, has been in charge before that, with the building of the war locomotive. He was a very ruthless man. He got what he wanted without looking for anything organizationally or what it was. He appointed people out of everywhere to his shop. And he did an excellent job, but he caused a lot of unrest and mistrust by my old people.
For example, I remember his first question of me was, how much does this thing weigh, this E4? And I said it weighs empty about 4 tons, and fully loaded it weighs about 12 tons. He said, well, I'm not interested in the fuel, I'm interested in the metal weight, 4 tons. Now a locomotive weighs about 100 tons, so the problem is about 1/25 of what building a locomotive.
But in the early months of 1943, the problems lie not only in production, but at Peenemünde itself. At the end of 1943, there are failures in further tests on the V-2. But then the course of the war turns against Germany. Hitler, who is said to have dreamed that the rocket will be of no use, summons Dornberger and von Braun to visit him.
When we came in, we had to wait first for a couple of hours. But then when we came in his bunker, I saw Hitler after a long time for the first time again. And he was very old. He was an old man with a hunched back and very pale face. He didn't look as if what we had thought would be a Führer.
They took with them to Hitler this film. It was silent and was narrated by von Braun. It showed the successful test of October 1942. It then went on to show how the rocket was tracked electronically. Following this with these scenes of pre-war Peenemünde. Finally, were superimposed the words, "We made it, after all."
But he got interested after we made our presentation. And he got so interested, he jumped up and jumped from the models to us and asked questions. It was like a completely change of a man. We didn't think that a man would be capable of doing that. And he was always interested if he saw a new big project. That was his weakness. He was always for new big projects. And then he gave us all the support we could get. He made Professor von Braun professor. He made me general and all this kind of stuff. You know what happens in such a situation.
At the end of the film, he made an interesting remark. He apologized to General Dornberger for not having believed in him, which is, I think, one of the very rare cases on record where he apologized to anyone. And he then apparently forgot about his infallible dreams quite abruptly, said, we think we have something pretty formidable here, and ordered immediately the highest priority to put this thing into quantity production.
He expected too much of that weapon. And that was the big setback of that meeting. We had developed a long-range weapon, which was just a weapon, but not a weapon which could destroy the whole world.
But then the bombing by the Allies meant that Germany's war production could not expand as fast as was needed to win the war. In spite of Hitler's dictum, Speer was unable to manipulate industry to produce the V-2. Speer was losing power to Himmler, head of the Secret Service, the SS, which was now trying to draw every institution in Germany into its tentacles. Early in April 1943, he secretly visited Peenemünde.
He came all by himself, driving his own car, and we learned about the whole visit only a day before. And he spent an evening informing himself about what was going on. And on the next day, I think we launched 2 V-2s. One failed miserably, destroyed 3 aircraft of our adjacent Luftwaffe airfield, which caused Himmler to make a remark that we seem to have a very effective close-range weapon here.
2 months later, Himmler paid a second visit, this time more conspicuously. But soon another development was to strengthen the influence of the SS over Peenemünde even further. In August 1943, Peenemünde, as well as the V-2 factories, are bombed by the British.
Air Marshal Harris, who was the bomber Harris, you know, in the RAF, as later records showed, had actually instructed the bomber pilot, get the scientists, because they can always rebuild the facility, but it's really the brains that we want to get, you know, who want to stop this rocket development.
The British had worked from aerial reconnaissance photographs such as this one of the test stand at Peenemünde. The fact that they knew of Peenemünde enabled the SS to argue that production must be moved to their new underground factories at Nordhausen, deep in the Harz Mountains. It was here that thousands of skilled workers from all over occupied Europe were forced under slave conditions to produce the huge and intricate weapon. It was now the end of 1943. The tide of the war had turned. What future did the weapon have? Mass production had started, but men had yet to be trained to fire it. Could Germany afford a new weapon when resources were so low, when in fact there was a rival? This is the V-1, developed at Peenemünde, but by the Air Force, a pilotless pulse jet, capable like the V-2 of carrying a 1-ton warhead, but costing a fraction of the price. Against the V-1, von Braun and his colleagues at Peenemünde argue that flying at the same speed as an aircraft, it can be shot down. However, by the end of 1943, the V-1 is in production and 3 months ahead of the V-2. While there have been 30,000 specification changes made to the V-2 over the last 6 months, the V-1 is extremely simple, both to construct and to fire. Meanwhile, the V-2, with its extraordinary complex mechanisms and in the rush for production, goes through yet another sequence of test failures. The failures, though dramatic, were in a sense to be expected with a mechanism that was breaking the bounds of conventional engineering. But the need for the rocket was growing ever more desperate to Himmler and his deputy Kammler.
Himmler told me, in essence, well, I hope you realize that this E-4 has ceased to be a toy, you know, for your engineers, that the whole German people is waiting for the new weapon of retaliation, you know, with the Allied bombings and all that. And I could full well imagine how you poor engineers there are completely encroached by this hidebound army bureaucracy and so forth. And why don't you join us and we here in the SS will really get this thing going, and you know I can always see Hitler whenever I have a problem and so forth, and you'll be much better off, reporting to me rather than Dornberger. And I told Kammler essentially that such a change in organizational arrangement at this moment would be downright disastrous to the program, that I couldn't ask for a better boss than General Dornberger, and I didn't think it was a good idea. Whereupon I was dismissed with a sourly smile, and about 3 weeks later I was arrested.
The main line of defense that Dornberger and we as a whole had was that we were the people who had the knowledge. The SS had the organization, they had the laborer, the slave labor and all this, but they didn't have in their own ranks the knowledge.
Well, I was finally gotten out of the jam. I mean, it was really a dangerous situation, I believe, in retrospect. I was gotten out of the jam simply by Dornberger, going all the way up to the top, speaking to people like Field Marshal Keitel, who at that time was commander of the armed forces, all three services, and saw Hitler on a daily basis, and he also talked to Speer and so forth. He convinced these people that if they kept me in a clink, there would be no E4.
It was now February 1944, with invasion by the Allies recognized as a certainty. Tests are run continuously in an attempt to catch up, many of them successful. But now a new problem arises. It is now discovered that many rockets thought to be successful are exploding on re-entering the atmosphere. All that can be done is to search for what fragments can be found. Without sophisticated telemetry, it's impossible to know what's going wrong. Twice the date for the military operation against Britain of the V-2 has been pushed back. Yet the nearer invasion comes, the greater importance the rocket assumes. A desperate battle is being fought against the inadequacies of technology and the reality of the war. Two weeks after D-Day, one of Hitler's vengeance weapons is launched. Not the V-2, but the Air Force's V-1. From June 1944 onwards, over 2,000 V-1s hit London, killing over 6,000 people. Those who had survived the Blitz earlier in the war spoke of the terrifying effect of these weapons. Nevertheless, only a quarter of those fired reached their target. But soon Germany was to be racked by another explosion.
Das ist der Schauplatz des verbrecherischen Anschlages, den ein kleiner gewissenloser Offiziere am 20. Juli auf den Führer und auf den Stab der Wehrmachtführung verübte.
On July 20th, 1944, a group of senior German army officers have attempted to assassinate Hitler by placing a bomb in his headquarters. This newsreel is put out to the German people, showing Hitler alive, but firmly surrounded by the SS. The army is finally out of power, and Dornberger pushed out of control by the SS, just as the rocket is ready for military use. By the fall of 1944, 350 V-2s are ready for launching from Holland. While the invading forces of the Allies move onwards toward Germany, this is Hitler's last desperate effort at retaliation. Problems with the rocket have been ironed out and production has gone ahead, but at incredible cost. For example, a huge amount of the German potato crop has been diverted from food to make alcohol for the rocket's fuel. Soon production is to reach 600 rockets a month. On September 8th, the first V-2 of a massive attack is launched against London. Over 500 V-2s land on London in the last months of the war, killing in 2 cases over 100 people at a time. The rocket is terrifying. It travels so fast that it cannot be heard. The government, uncertain of the number of rockets Germany has, censors the press to prevent panic, so that these pictures were not released until the 1950s. Others have speculated that were the rocket ready 6 months earlier, the Normandy invasion could not have taken place. But contrary to what many people think, it was not London that received the worst attack. Over 1,000 V-2s were launched against the harbor of Antwerp in Belgium, the Allies' main supply port. This is the result of one of them. A single rocket in Antwerp killed 271 people. But Germany was now in the final throes of the war.
As the British and Canadians swerved toward the Zuyder Zee, the Americans crossed the Elbe and the Russians the Oder. Germany is crumbling. And
the Allies advance over the western border of Germany, capturing on their way a trainload of V-2s.
There is happiness in England.
Now those left at Peenemünde have to decide what will be the fate of themselves and their ideas.
January of 45, the military situation in Germany had deteriorated to the point where we could hear the Russian guns in the distance, and it was pretty obvious that we were confronted with a choice either to evacuate immediately and move west, or to wait for the Red Army to roll over.
Dieter Hutzel, personal assistant of von Braun at Peenemünde, and later at Rockwell International.
I got a call from von Braun and left myself on the 13th of March. I was entrusted with the secret documents and other classified material and asked to hide them somewhere. For that purpose, I had to move north again. I found a suitable place in a mine, and after that had been accomplished, I returned to Bleicherode to report what I had accomplished. However, everyone had already left, including von Braun, so I had to move right on to Bavaria. Here I found him in Oberammergau, in a building that was occupied by an SS detachment.
When Kammler found out that we had moved into this area, he one fine day hit upon the idea of picking out the 500 key scientists and engineers of Peenemünde and moving them to Bavaria under the pretext that they were too valuable to be captured by the Allies, but I still believe with the real idea of using us as bargaining chips to save his own life.
There were sinister-looking fellows walking around, and I found von Braun inside of the building. I started reporting to him, but he said, do that later. Let's talk later about that. So after he was through with his business there, we went outside and I told him where the documents were.
In the midst of all this, I was also involved in an automobile accident and broke my left arm, so I was hospitalized. It was a pretty confusing situation.
He then said, we will not stay here in Oberammergau. We will move in with Dornberger, who has requisitioned a nice hotel in the Alps.
Suddenly a man came into my hospital room and said, General Dornberger wants you to immediately leave the hospital here and join him up in a hotel higher up in the mountains, because the Free French Army was only about an hour away from Sonthofen, was the name of the town of Sonthofen. And if you don't want to be caught by the Free French, but wait for the war to end and the American army to wind up in American hands, you better leave that place.
We expected to be overrun there by the Americans, not knowing that this was a demarcation line between the French and the Americans. So after the radio had told us for several days that Germany was now all overrun and the fighting had come to an end, still no one had shown up, French or American. So it was decided that von Braun's brother Magnus would be sent down to the American side and tell them where we were and that we were prepared to surrender. He went down with a bicycle, came back the same evening and said all arrangements had been made, and we all went down the next day reported in at a border station to an American guard, and were then escorted into the small town of Reutte, where we stayed overnight, fairly comfortable. There was some name-taking and listing and of who and what, but not too much interrogation at that point. Next morning we had breakfast, after which we emerged from the mess hall into the cool, crisp air of that alpine region to face the cameras.
General Dornberger, Dieter Hutzel, Werner von Braun. This is the first film taken by their new allies of those who made the V-2. Of the top 125 engineers from Peenemünde, 124 came to the United States. They came now to work for the U.S. Army, living as non-citizens in Army camps in a state of internment. Eventually, the government had to transfer them across the Mexican border so that they could re-enter the country legally. Free as American citizens, they then spread out into the U.S. arms and space industry. There, they played a fundamental part in developing both the Apollo moon program and ballistic missiles, now carrying nuclear warheads.
This program was produced by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content.